the unintended effects of covert action, right? So consequences come back to a society in response to actions that the society does not even know took place, right? So in the case of September 11th, you have a classic example of blowback, right? Which is that there was covert action through the CIA, the funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. That was really the key event that led to the building of Al-Qaeda, and also the construction of military bases in Saudi Arabia. And these events blew back on the American public. But because there were so many missing pieces of the story, because so much of it was covert action, that state of shock, that state of disorientation that led people to say this came out of nowhere. You know, one minute we were watching Friends, the next minute this was happening. That state of shock, that gap between event and story could not have been more pronounced, right? So what was when you have that gap open up, what you need to do is you need to fill it really fast to get your bearings again, right? And the best way to fill it is to investigate. Is to actually, nothing comes out of nowhere. There's a reason for everything. So it's to learn. And interestingly, that's what the first reaction was on the part of so many North Americans after September 11th. It was to gather, to talk, to process, to learn whatever people could, right? Running out buying books, weirdly buying the Quran, thinking there was going to be some secret message in there that would explain everything. But also buying books of history, and buying books by Noam Chomsky, who talked about this unknown history, this history unknown to so many Americans. Now, what did the Bush administration say? They said, well, first of all, they said, go shopping, right? Which is the most isolating thing you can do, right? So the impulse is actually to gather, to come together, to fill those gaps, to come together as a community, to reconstitute a story. And the message you're getting is actually, no, just be an isolated consumer, just go shopping to fight terrorism. But the other thing we heard was that process of trying to fill that gap, that process of understanding history, is not only unnecessary, but actually rationalizing the actions of the terrorists, and is therefore in line with the terrorists. And in this new world of us versus them, you're either with us or against us, essentially makes you a terrorist, or at least a terrorist sympathizer, so you better not do it, right? So these things that actually would have taken the society out of shock, the coming together, and the reconnection with a pre-9/11 past, were severed, really quite deliberately, by the government. And replaced with this isolation on the one hand, and this severing of history on the other. This phrase, pre-9/11 thinking, started coming up again and again. And another phrase, 9/11 changed everything, which was basically the same idea, that there was a rupture in time and space, and that everything you thought you knew before September 11th no longer applied, because the world had been born anew. So all of these strategies actually deepened that state of shock and disorientation. And that window that opens up when a state of shock exists was greatly exacerbated. And people were very ready for news stories, because we can't exist without stories. We are our stories. It's the most profoundly human impulse we have, the narration of our lives, the connection to place and time. So in that state of disorientation, when we became people with no pasts, allegedly, there were news stories that were handed down to us, pre-made, ready-made stories. Clash of civilization, the axis of evil, war against Islamofascism, these new narratives. And in the absence of any narrative, and in that state of disorientation, they were very seductive. It was very seductive because everybody needs a story, and people clung to these new ready-made stories that were handed down from on high. Now, I mentioned that I had this wonderful privilege to travel with this thesis. And one of the last places that I traveled to was Spain. The book came out in Spanish a few weeks ago. And I happened to be in Spain at a really interesting time for that country, because while I was in Madrid presenting the book, the convictions were handed down for the terrible terrorist attacks that took place on March 11th, 2004, the bombings of the trains and train stations in Madrid, which in Spain is often referred to as Spain's 9/11. And it was interesting to be there in that moment, first of all, because it was an example of how a society coped with a horrific attack through their legal system, right? I mean, they were taking it for granted, but as an outsider, it was quite exotic to see these very serious charges being handled in criminal court under the full view of the media. Nobody was being kidnapped and taken anywhere. Nobody was having their rights to habeas corpus suspended. The system was being allowed to work, and there was a public debate about whether the convictions were strong enough or not, but these were not treated as exceptional cases. They were being treated as extreme criminal cases. So I spent a fair amount of time when I was in Spain talking to people about why they had such a different conclusion, such a different reaction, why they hadn't given up so many of their rights after their September 11th. Because of course in the US there's tremendous regret about the regression that took place after September 11th, that moment. You know, another word for shock is regression. Is that childlike state when we look to strong leaders and think Rudy Giuliani is our long lost daddy. I mean, this is what happens, and it's awfully dangerous. You know, and there were U.S. politicians who played that role of the protector very, very well, and even terrible leadership, really, when the facts are looked at, was overlooked because of this ability to role-play strength. Right? Americans eat this up, whether it's Schwarzenegger, Giuliani, or Bush after 9/11. The ability to project that in-charge father figure was tremendously rewarding. And of course, Giuliani is now running for president on his 9/11 moment. You know, reminding Americans, remember when I was your daddy, essentially, is his entire election platform. So interestingly, immediately after those terrible attacks in Madrid, at the time, Spain was headed by a right-wing government led by a man named José María Aznar. José María Aznar responded instantly to those attacks, doing his very best Bush-Giuliani impersonation. He immediately laid blame before they knew anything. This is what one does, it seems. He decided to blame ETA, the Basque separatists. Even though there was no evidence whatsoever, he immediately blamed ETA. But at the same time, he said, and this is why we're in Iraq, because we have to fight this type of evil, which made no sense. I mean, if it was ETA, what does that have to do with Iraq? But in other words, he was just using the event for whatever political advantage he could, right? In the same way that the Bush administration just ran through the Patriot Act immediately in that window of fear. You had this same process of telling people to be afraid, stay in their homes. There would be entirely new rules. Now, what was interesting was how Spaniards responded to this blatant opportunism. The day after the attacks, there were huge protests in Madrid, which is really quite remarkable because at this stage, they didn't know who the attackers were, and they were still at large. There could have been more attacks. And people were afraid. They were afraid, and they had every reason to be afraid. And yet there were mass demonstrations, demonstrations that could themselves have been targets, right? But people didn't care. They came together by the hundreds of thousands, and they had marches against fear, which is an interesting thing to have a march against, right? An emotion, your own emotion. They were marching against their own fear, okay? They had recognized that what Aznar was playing on was their fear, that he was trying to deepen it, fear of the other. And they saw this as dangerous. And even in their moment of fear, they still did something that was actually risky, that was actually courageous, to go into the streets, make themselves targets, take this stand, come together, right? Not stay isolated in their homes. And interestingly, and lucky for them, they were also, something else was going on at that time, which was they were having elections. And the day after those huge demonstrations, Spaniards went to the polls in presidential elections. And Aznar's party was roundly defeated. And a new government was elected, a government promising to pull troops out of Iraq. Something similar just happened today in Australia, actually. They're on something of a roll. So when I was in Spain, I asked a lot of people why they had this instant reaction. Because there was no organizing that took place that told people, okay, this is what we're going to do. It was this almost like a collective epiphany that this is what had to happen. And I heard the same response again and again and again. What people said was, Aznar reminded us of Franco. That there was a way in which he was playing on their collective fear, turning them against each other, that they recognized as the early signs of fascism. And they recognized their own fear as the enemy, and in that decisive moment, because how we respond to a shock, how we respond to a crisis is up to us, they chose another path. And it was that knowledge of history, really, that was so key. And I think it also tells us something about why North Americans are particularly vulnerable to these type of tactics, because we don't have a very strong sense of history here. We have more fairy tales than we have history. We have fairy tales about Canada the good, and America the perfect. Gary Wills, a wonderful historian in the United States, describes this as the state of original sinlessness. And it really is a liability in a state of shock, because it is in those moments when you need realism. And fairy tales really weigh you down. Fairy tales being the opposite of a true historical reckoning. And I think Canada really suffers from this in this moment, where because we are in so much denial about our own colonial past, and we live on such fantasies